Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Selling Greenville, your favorite real estate podcast here in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm your host, as always, Stan McCune, realtor right here in Greenville, South Carolina, and you can find all of my contact information in the show notes. If you need a realtor in the Greenville area or even outside the area, I can send you to our relocations department. They can help you, connect you with a realtor all over the country. So just let me know, look in the show notes. And please, as a reminder, if you like this content, all you got to do is subscribe, hit the like button, leave a little rating, just support the show in these ways. You might never use me as your realtor, but in these simple, concrete ways, you can support the show. Today, I'm very excited to have a guest on the show. I have John Boyd, the founder and CEO of Banker Exchange. They handle 1031 exchanges all over the country, although they are a Greenville-based business. So, John, welcome to the show, and thank you for coming on.
Great. Thanks, Stan. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Absolutely. And, I've had a lot of clients over the years that have done 1031 exchanges. I have a very tragic story of my own where I didn't do one and should have, because I was not intending to purchase another property. And then the absolute perfect, like once in a lifetime property became available as soon as I had sold another property. So 1031 exchanges are something that's happening in this market. And it's not just something that big commercial brokers and commercial investors are doing. I see a lot of mom and pop 1031 exchanges, but I'm guessing a lot of people a lot of my listeners are pretty educated, but there might be a few that either don't know exactly what it is or don't have all the specifics down. So what's your elevator pitch on what a 1031 exchange is?
Great question, Stan. The 1031 is a real estate strategy used by investors with trade, business, or investment property to defer the taxes on the disposition of that property and the repurchase or purchase of an alternate piece of property.
And in terms of what that looks like, explain, or maybe let's just do an example. Can you give an example of what sort of capital gains taxes an investor selling real estate in Greenville might have to pay? Obviously, we're not an accountant. We're not giving financial advice or accounting advice or anything. And it all depends on a whole lot of different things, right? The income they're bringing in, there's a lot. But can you just give an example of what could be theoretically possible?
So there are multiple taxes that you pay on the disposition of a piece of real estate that has appreciated. We call that gain. The first and foremost is if it was depreciable property. In other words, you've taken depreciation on that property previously, you have depreciation recapture, and there's one rate for that. It can run as high as 25%. The second tax that we encounter is the federal capital gains tax, and that's at the federal level. You can have anywhere from 0% up to about 20% in federal capital gains tax. Okay. The third that you will encounter,
and just to be clear, are all of those taxes so far? Well, that one tax was on what was depreciated during the ownership. Right. The second tax, the capital gains tax, that's not on the entire sale. That's specifically on the gain.
That's specifically on the gain. Okay. And then South Carolina, if you're a resident of the state of South Carolina or tax filer where the property is located in South Carolina is going to assess a tax on your profit there as well. Okay. And that is a little bit lower, runs about 3.5 to 3.96%. And then the fourth tax was introduced by President Obama, and that was the tax on net investment income. And that's 3.8%. So all told, you could be looking at 40 to 50%. If you're in a high tax city, if you're in a city that also has a city tax, or you're in a high tax state, such as New York or New Jersey or California, those rates can climb even higher.
How many states are currently imposing their own capital gains on these sort of real estate?
That's a great question. There's a handful of states that don't have any state income tax at all, but pretty much all the other states do impose a state income tax. So that number's 42, 43.
Okay. All right. So what happens to all of those taxes that you listed out when someone does a 1031 exchange? And I think, we'll get into a little bit more of the specifics on timeframes and whatnot, but essentially 1031 exchange, when you're selling a property and then you immediately purchase another property to replace it. And obviously there is some paperwork involved, and that's where a company like Banker Exchange, which is a 1031 exchange intermediary, that's where you guys become involved to ensure that that all is handled properly and that people don't do things in a way that they're going to end up getting blindsided by a tax on the back end. But what exactly happens to those taxes when the 1031 exchange is done?
Well, that's a great question. So 1031 is a deferral mechanism. It's not forgiveness. So those taxes actually get the proverbial kicking the can down the road. So those taxes are deferred until you ultimately dispose of the last piece of replacement property purchased in a 1031. So you do have the ability to link 1031s. You sell property one, or you dispose of property one, you buy property two in an exchange, you dispose of property two, acquire property three, and those taxes all along are getting deferred. And then ultimately, if you dispose of the final property, let's say property three, in a sale transaction, those taxes become due. Okay. The one exception to that, or one of the exceptions to that, is a technique that estate planning lawyers use and that we help with. It's called swap till you drop. Okay. And under current estate tax law, if you die owning appreciated real estate, your estate gets to mark that basis up to the fair market value on your date of death. So for instance, I've done an exchange for 25 years and I die with $1 million worth of deferred gain. Okay. And on my date of death, my heirs get to step the fair market value of that asset up to the fair market value.
The asset being the very first asset that you sold?
Property.
The last property. Okay.
Because that's the only one I own at that point.
Okay.
And so the last piece of property I own gets marked up to fair market value, and all those deferred taxes get wiped out. So it's a pretty good technique for the heirs. It does not the greatest technique for the taxpayer.
Right. So then if the I understand that. So if the heirs, so let's play this out. So the heirs inherit this property.
Okay.
Let's say they inherit, 10 condos, for instance, a little 10 condo complex.
Okay.
And they receive it from their parents, and their parents had done, let's say if they bought a $50,000 shack, back in the day, and then they did a 1031 exchange and bought a nicer house, and then they turned that and they sold that and then did a 1031 into a quadruplex, and they sold that and did a 1031, to this condo community. And that purchase was, let's just say, 1.5 million. Okay, with the final one. So they start at 50,000. Now they're all the way up to 1.5 million, right? So the basis is, explain to the listener what the basis would be at this point.
Well, so your basis in your replacement property carries over from your relinquished property. So let's start with that $50,000 house. Okay. Chances are that they have taken depreciation on that house during the time they owned it. Pretty standard allocation, 20% for the land, 80% for the building. Okay. So that residential house would have been depreciated over 27 and a half years. And very likely, by the time the parents have passed away and passed it on to the kids, it's fully depreciated. So we've taken $40,000 worth of depreciation on a $50,000 house. Okay. Now let's assume that there was no additional money put in each time they traded. They traded up, but they didn't add any equity to it.
Okay.
In the form of either cash or debt. So their basis in that condominium complex that they've purchased, that eightplex, is $10,000. Its fair market value is $1.5 million. So in that transaction, there's $1,490,000 worth of gain.
That would be taxable.
If properly structured, is going to get wiped off the table.
So then they pass away. Their heirs inherit this little condo complex.
Right.
And now explain, pick up where you left off on the basis side of things and explain how this works for them.
So they would get a step up in basis. So their fair market value would be that $1.5 million to the, to the heirs. They could either sell it at that point, and if they sold it for $1.5 million, there's no gain. If they sold it for $1.75 million, let's say 12 months down the road, they sold that property for $1.75 million, there's a $250,000 gain. So all the gain up until the date of death is wiped out.
And who determines the fair market
Stan,
value?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I'll come back to that question. What were you going to say?
Let me point something out. It's very important that this transfer go through the estate or the probate process, okay, and not be what we call a deathbed bequest. Okay. There's nothing sadder for somebody to call into our office and say, well, I inherited this from my mother, and there's an asset with $2 million worth of deferred gain. And I said, well, did you inherit it from your mother, or did she give it to you, deed it to you before she passed away on her deathbed? Okay. That 5 minutes can make a world of difference, because if she gifted it to you before she died, her basis becomes your basis.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
That would
but
be
if
tragic.
she waited until she died and it went through the estate process, then you get to step up in the fair market value, and your basis is now $1.5 million.
That's a really great point, because some people might think, oh, I can avoid the probate process and all of this by just doing, a deathbed sort of transaction. But yeah, if you've got all that deferred taxes, no, don't do it. Again, not accounting advice, but don't do it.
Yeah, it's very important that you have a very qualified tax attorney and, estate attorney, that your will is properly drafted, and that you have a super competent CPA or somebody from a tax preparer standpoint that you're relying.
So the question I was going to ask before was, when that person passes away, the heirs receive that property, who determines the fair market value? How's that determined?
Well, it's best determined through an appraisal. That way you have a disinterested third party making that determination. So we always encourage clients, no matter what's going to transpire, what kind of transfer, that they have an appraisal done.
And so it sounds like that's not a requirement. Is that just like a CYA kind of thing? Like if the IRS comes knocking at your door?
You're covering your basis. You're covering, in the event you got examined and you got questioned about the value, you're basically covering your backside.
Gotcha. Okay.
Real estate's a little bit different, than liquid investments like stocks and bonds.
Sure.
They have a ready market you can look up at the end of any day.
Yep.
Okay. If somebody stood in front of your house with a sign, like we do with the stock market, you'd probably be mortified at how the price went up and down throughout, a month-long period of time. As more people become interested in buying, or fewer people become interested in buying, prices would go up and prices would go down.
Sure. Well, that's kind of what Zillow's doing, right? They're kind of planting their sign in front of all of our yards and telling us what their estimate thinks is happening every day.
They think it's worth.
So obviously 1031 exchanges are an immensely powerful tool for real estate investors in particular, who are, not wanting to pay those horrible capital gains taxes. And me having paid them before, and I flip houses that are not eligible for 1031 exchanges, which perhaps we should address that here in a second, why they aren't. But it's not a fun tax to have to pay. But I'm curious, do you think that there is a risk, because I've heard some talk about this in the past, is there a risk of 1031 exchanges going away, of an administration getting rid of them?
Well, first of all, I don't think they're going to go away in their entirety. I think they're too much of a powerful tool for wealth building for the citizens of this country, who probably need that tool to secure their financial future. Okay. Keep in mind that the non-taxable transaction has been around since 1921. Okay. This is not a new concept. Okay. And there were a couple things that gave rise to that. One was in 1921, we had what we called direct exchanges. If I had a piece of property that you wanted and you had a piece of property that I wanted, we went down to the lawyer's office and we traded deeds. And there were two things. There's two things that are imperative to assess a tax. Okay. There's one thing is you have to have a valuation, a way of valuing the transaction. Well, if I give you 5 acres and you give me 5 acres, and this is 1921, what's not running around in every town in 1921? There's not an appraiser running around telling you what something's worth. Okay. You and I came to an agreement on what our properties were worth and decided that. So number one, there was a measurement issue, okay, that gave rise to this. And number two, there's a wherewithal to pay, because you and I were in the exact same position after the transaction that we were in before the transaction. Okay. Now, did we have a gain? No, we were in the same position before and after. Okay. But technically we had taxable transactions. Okay. But neither one of us had any cash from that transaction. So neither one of us had the wherewithal to pay whatever tax may be assessed. Okay. So I think what we'll see is we may see a tightening up of the definition. Okay. We've already seen certain assets go away. I think it was the Tax Cut and Jobs Act in 2017 that took away 1031 exchanges on all classes of assets other than real estate. There were two words inserted into the code in 2017, and those two words were real estate. Okay. It used to say assets held for trade, business, or investment.
Interesting.
Okay. So you could trade cattle, you could trade horses, you could trade sports contracts, you could trade aircraft. And we did a fair number of aircraft exchanges prior to that. Okay. There was one qualified intermediary out of Boston whose entire business was trading aircraft for the big boys.
Wow.
Okay.
I could see how among a certain demographic that would be a great tax strategy.
Oh, it was. And but the National Association of Realtors, okay, is a very, very powerful lobby. And they were able to negotiate for 1031 to be left in the code.
Interesting. And so what kind of tightening do you think that we could see? And maybe we need to, before you answer that, maybe you need to address what properties are eligible for a 1031 exchange, because I already kind of referenced that flips are not, so we can start with that.
And that'll lead into your buy, fix, and flip model. So Section 1031 applies to any property, any real property used in a trade or business or bought for investment. Okay. And it's your intent at the time you acquire it, if it's your replacement property, or it's your intent at the time you dispose of it, if it's your relinquished property. Okay. And so it's really trade, business, or investment. Now, 1031, the regulations exclude certain assets. They exclude your principal residence. Okay, that gain's covered under a different section of the Internal Revenue Code, 121. It excludes partnership interests, like if you buy an interest in an LLC. Okay, it also excludes property bought for speculation or property bought for resale. We'll come back to that. And it excludes vacation and second homes. Okay. And it's interesting because I live in a market where we're not talking about vacation and second homes. We're talking about vacation and third, fourth, or fifth homes. Okay. I operate out of an office right outside of Aspen, Colorado. And the main office is there in Greenville, as you alluded to. But I have the privilege of working out of Colorado about 8 months out of the year. So the tremendous number of vacation and second homes with a tremendous amount of appreciation. Okay. But they don't have the benefit of 1031 unless they can change the characteristics of that property before they sell it. Okay. Now, addressing your buy, fix, and flip investor. Okay. When you buy a property and your intention is to buy it, fix it, and resell it, you're buying that property for resale. Okay. So you are specifically excluded from 1031. And we have a lot of clients who are in that that business of buy, fix, and flip. What we see is they have some that they buy, fix, and flip, and they have some that they buy, fix, and hold. And what we encourage them to do is put them in separate entities. Your buy, fix, and flip are in one entity, and your buy, fix, and hold are in the other entity. Okay? Because your buy, fix, and hold, or what I like to say is buy, fix, lease, and dispose. Okay? You can buy it, you can fix it up, you can lease it, and your strategy is maybe my tenant will want to buy that house 12 or 14 months down the road. Okay. Maybe they have financial problems. Maybe there's something, there's an economic reason they can't buy a house today, but they're not bad people. Okay. And so if you buy it, you fix it, you lease it, and then you sell it, that property would qualify. But if you just buy it, fix it, and flip it, then
Does not qualify.
That's not qualify.
So you said something earlier that piqued my interest. You said you gave the example of the vacation homes are not eligible, but then you said unless they change something with regard to the property.
The characteristics.
Okay. What would that entail?
So there's a revenue procedure that was issued in 2008. It's Revenue Procedure 2008-16, and it came about because real estate investors or owners were coming across an interesting problem. And I'll share an example.
Well, they were having a lot of problems in 2008.
Excuse me?
They were having a lot of problems in 2008. So yeah.
Well, but the issue was, here was the issue, okay? You bought a house on Lake Toxaway, or you bought a house on Lake Summit, okay? You were one of the first people up there, okay? You're 90 years old now. You bought it when your kids were little. You've owned this house for 50 or 60 years. Okay. You bought it when your kids were little, but your kids grew up and moved away. And you didn't go up to that house very much. As a matter of fact, you haven't been up to that house in 10 years. Okay. It just sits there. Okay. But you never really thought about selling it.
Sure.
Okay. And nobody uses it. Okay. Maybe your kids go up there 2 weeks a year.
Sure. Yep.
Okay. Is that a vacation or second home? Or do you own that piece of property for investment?
Yes.
And that's where we were running into problems, is people were saying, well, I don't use this house enough to justify owning this house. Okay. I can give you a different, a more kind of toxic example. And so the question was, is that person eligible for 1031? Okay. And the IRS got tired of fighting about it in court. And so what they said is, okay, here's what we're going to do. If prior to you disposing of that house, you've changed its characteristics by renting that house for 2 weeks in each of the 2 12-month periods prior to the sale at fair market value to an unrelated party, and you have restricted your personal use to the greater of 2 weeks or 10% of the time that it's rented, we won't question whether it was trade, business, or investment property or not. We will give you a free pass, and it's called the safe harbor. We won't contest that it was trade, business, or investment property. We won't go try to make the argument that it was a second home or a vacation home. Okay?
Interesting.
But that takes 2 years of planning.
What about
people?
You can't just make that decision a couple months before you're about to sell. I've heard some people talk about over the years, if you got a property like this, you can spend time over there, working on the property. And perhaps some people take advantage of that, but what are the rules with regard to that? Overnighting out a property if you're doing work on
it. Days you spend doing maintenance on it, and again, this is an accounting question, not a qualified intermediary question, but the days that you spend over there doing work on the property don't count towards your personal occupancy. Okay. Now, what that doesn't mean is if you have 20 steps going up or 14 steps going up the outside of your house, okay, that you get to spend 14 days there because every morning you get up and you paint one step. Okay. That's where the abuses come in.
Yeah, of
And
course.
it's very hard to know. It's difficult. And remember, the burden of proof on examination is on the taxpayer.
Yep.
And people say, well, how would somebody know that I was there? Okay, well, the power bill goes up and the water bill goes up when the house is occupied. Okay, those are third parties that can say, yes, they use, you're not going to carry your water in a jug, and you're not going to run a generator to power your house. Okay, but everybody in our generation carries a cell phone. And they have the ability to triangulate that cell phone position. They can say, well, we got your cell phone records and you were pinging off of these three towers, and these three towers tell us that you were at this house right here.
The IRS has a lot of tools at their disposal if they need to use it.
Exactly.
And so does the Department of Revenue, for that matter. They're I don't personally know anyone over there, but they've been nasty to me in the past.
Yeah. So
here's kind of, I actually I didn't plan to ask this question, but I'm just kind of curious. Do you see any future with like Bitcoin or crypto or anything like that with regard to all of this, with regard to buying, selling, 1031 exchanges? Is that something that's being talked about in your industry at all?
I haven't heard any conversations about, when somebody comes in and wants to buy a house with Bitcoin. But I can see, I mean, anything is, negotiable collateral.
Sure.
I mean, literally, I mean, you can come in and say, I want to buy your beach house and I want to give you my yacht down in the Caribbean. Okay. Well, how easy is that 1031 exchange to do? Well, the qualified intermediary is going to take this yacht in, and he's either got to find, you either as the exchangeor have to find a seller for your replacement property who's willing to take that yacht as consideration, or the QI's got to monetize that yacht and sell it within the tight time frame, within the 180 days. So you have the cash to go buy the real estate that you want. Bitcoin being a little bit more liquid, I could see that conceivably becoming a consideration in future exchanges.
Interesting.
It'll present some challenges early on, but over time it'll get easier and easier.
So I know you can do a partial exchange. So, let's say that you sell a $500,000 property and do an exchange, and then the next property you purchase is say 400,000. You're not
Okay.
I guess in the ideal scenario you're purchasing a more expensive property. That way you get the entire tax hit of the various taxes that you discussed deferred. But if you purchase a cheaper property, you're still going to end up paying some of those taxes, correct?
That's correct. So that's called a partial exchange. They happen a couple of ways. One of them is intentionally. We've had clients come into our office who were selling property, and they were literally land poor. Okay. They had a high net worth, but they had no liquidity and they had no other assets other than real estate. And the husband sat there and he said, here's what I'm going to do. He said, I'm going to buy this, 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 and this. And I looked at his wife and I said, what do you want? And she said, I want a new car and I want to take a trip around the world.
There you go.
And I looked at him and I said, we're going to take an exception. You're going to pay some taxes on this money, but we're going to make her happy too. Okay. Because he really did need to go buy another $4, $5, $6, or $7 million worth of real estate, even though it would produce a nice income.
Sure.
Okay. Diversification is a good thing, particularly when you're talking about our financial assets. And so, partial exchanges are possible. That's an intentional, that was an intentional partial exchange. But if you get into your exchange and you're going to buy 3 properties, you've identified 3 properties and one of them falls out for some reason, fails inspection, burns down, gets washed away in a flood. You name why it's not there anymore, it's not available to be purchased, and you can only buy 2 of the 3 properties you identified, then it's typically what we call an unintentional.
Explain that, because we've been kind of and I like how this conversation has gone, that we've kind of rather than just dumping it all on the listener at the beginning, you've kind of explained in at different stages the different parts of the 1031. Why don't you talk about that identifying a property piece? Because I don't think we covered that yet.
All right. So when you engage in a 1031 exchange, there are two time frames that you have to be cognizant of. One of them is your identification period, and one of it is your exchange period. And both of those time frames start on the day you transfer the relinquished property. So let's say, okay, and your identification period expires on midnight of the 45th day following the transfer of the relinquished property. And your exchange period expires at the earlier of the due date of your tax return, including extensions, or the 180th day following the transfer of the relinquished property. So what does that mean? Okay, 45 days is 45 days. But the 180 days, if you close after, it's about October 17th or 18th, depending on if it's a leap year. Okay, if you want to get your full 180 days, you've got to file an extension to your tax return. Talking about an individual investor here who's required to file by April 15th. Okay, because if you back up from April 15th, 180 days prior is like October 17th. Okay, so if you close on December 31st, your exchange is going to expire on April 15th unless you file an extension to your tax return. Okay, now those dates are absolute. Those 45 and 180, we're going to assume you've got the 180. Those are absolute. It's the only place in the Internal Revenue Code where there are no extensions if a deadline falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or a legal holiday.
Interesting.
Okay, so there have been times where I literally took an identification in person, okay, at 11 o'clock at night, standing at the corner of Washington Street and Stone Avenue. Okay, there's a convenience store there. Okay, and I knew that the convenience store would have cameras. So if I needed any proof that that transaction occurred prior to midnight, I had it.
Interesting.
Okay.
So what is the, sorry, go ahead.
So within the 45 days, you have to transmit your identification to your qualified intermediary. Okay. Or someone else who's a party to the exchange who's not disqualified. We won't get into that. That's a much deeper dive. Okay. But in our office, we require you to transmit the identification sheet to our office, but that's a tighter rule than the regulations put forth.
And in terms of what sort of properties people can identify, what are the rules there?
Okay, so they can identify any property that's going to be used in a trade or business or held for investment. Okay, so virtually any piece of real estate can qualify for 1031 exchange. Okay, if you live in a house and if somebody's selling a house in Collins Creek, okay, and it's their primary residence, but you're going to buy that house to turn it into a rental, that's perfectly acceptable.
Sure.
Okay. And it's important to know that it refers to the nature or character of the property, not the grade or quality. So what that allows you to do is you can trade raw land for single family residential. You can trade multifamily residential for self-storage for office buildings for raw land. So it doesn't matter what asset class you're coming out of or going into, as long as it's for trade, business, or investment purposes.
So you got 45 days to identify up to 3 properties that you might want to purchase. Once that 45
day limitations, we'll talk limitations. So you can identify 3 properties of any value. So if you dispose of $1 million piece of property, you can identify 3 properties of any value. If you identify more than 3 properties, the fair market value of everything that you identify cannot exceed 200% of the fair market value of what you gave up. So if I sold for $1 million, okay, my limitation is 200% or $2 million, but only if I'm going to identify 4 or more properties.
Okay. And you could, in theory, do the exchange and purchase multiple of those 4 properties.
Yeah, there's no limitation to the number of properties you can purchase.
So how does that work? Do those all have to be purchased on the same day? Can it be done over time?
No, it can be done over time. I did a transaction, oh, it was the late nineties. Some folks sold a piece of property to a large retailer for them to build a store. And they went from being landowners to, they bought about 35 or 40 individual single family homes
Oh, wow.
in the community they lived. Okay. And they did that all within 45 days.
They identified them all within 45 days, or they purchased them all in 45
They
days?
purchased them all within
Wow.
45
But they
days.
didn't have to purchase them. They could have followed the 180-day rule for the
They could
purchasing
have,
period.
but the challenge that they were facing is, what were they going to buy, and were they going to violate the 200% rule?
Sure.
So they went ahead and got everything lined up and had it ready to close.
How
And I
about
was
that?
literally, I mean, the closing attorney would call me and say, "We're closing today," and I'd say, "Okay," and just I was sending documents literally about every other day.
I believe it. That's
And when
crazy.
it was over, it was two 3 or 4 inch binders full of documents.
I believe that. Well, yeah, y'all must have had an office party when that one closed.
So it was well, it was crazy.
I
It
don't
was
doubt it.
crazy.
What percentage of people who hire you guys to help them perform an exchange don't end up ever finding the right property, don't end up actually doing an exchange?
It's a relatively small number of people. I would put that number probably at 5 to 7%. Okay, and a total, and maybe less than that, and a total um, frustration is what we call it. When an exchange doesn't work, we call it a frustrated exchange. And so, probably 3 to 5, maybe as high as 7%. Now, some of those are intentional, and I know that sounds crazy, but because of the interplay of various internal revenue sections, somebody that disposes of a piece of property, let's say in September, okay, of 2024, that's going to have a giant tax bill. And they're like, I don't want to pay my taxes in 2024. I think the rates are going to go down in 2025. Is there any way for me to kick this transaction, this tax liability from 2024 into 2025? So as long as they have a bona fide intent to do the exchange, they haven't touched their money in 2024. They don't get their money until 2025 because of the section of the Internal Revenue Code on installment sales, okay, that says if you don't get paid, you don't have to pay the taxes. That's that wherewithal to pay that we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If they don't get their money from their qualified intermediary until, well, we said August, so that's 8 plus 6 is 14. In February, the qualified intermediary sends them their money. When is that transaction taxable? Well, under the installment sale rules, they can make an election to have it taxed in 2025 or in 2024.
Interesting.
So if they've got certain factors going into their personal income tax return that they might want to kick that tax into the next year, it makes sense.
Okay. So that's interesting. Now, I'm curious about you mentioned the word frustrated with regard to the people that don't end up that want to complete a 1031 and it just doesn't work out. How do you ever get the sense that some people are just kind of settling to purchase that next property just to defer their taxes and they're not really happy with the next one that they get, or do you not really get that
Well,
sense from where you sit?
the answer is yes. I think there are people that make bad decisions. They make bad economic decisions to avoid the taxes. And I mean, what I tell people is don't let the tax tail wag the dog. Okay.
It's great advice.
Because, the taxes are high. Okay. But the loss of capital is even higher.
Sure.
If you lost all of that capital because you made a bad decision, okay, and an over leveraged property, and we saw a lot of this, in 2008, there were a lot of properties that people bought that either they got lost because of foreclosure, because their loans got called and they didn't have the wherewithal to pay them off, or they were in a syndication. They bought into a pool, an asset that was owned by multiple individuals, and that asset got foreclosed on, or that's the real big one, got foreclosed on by the lender because it was over leveraged. and they thought their cash flow was secure. And at the end of the day, they didn't lose. They lost all their money, not just the tax.
Yeah, that was a rough time, as I
And
alluded
so,
to before.
I can't, we try to look at the overall picture. When somebody comes to us and says, what do you think I ought to do? And sometimes they ask me, and sometimes, they don't care for my opinion. That's okay.
What are some of the challenges that people run into when they're trying to do a 1031 exchange, besides the obvious of the challenges of identifying a property and whatnot that, within a 45-day period?
Well, when you're in a tight market where you have a lot of buyers and not very many sellers, and prices get bid up, and it's a very rapidly moving market, that presents some challenges. That's and the 45-day identification period, trying to find something. Okay. Now you don't have to have it under contract. It doesn't have to be listed. Okay. But 45 days comes very quickly.
Yeah, it does.
Particularly if you close. I mean, think about if you close in
December.
Well, I'm thinking more about first part of June to the middle part of June. Okay. Because in any exchange transaction, there's multiple parties. There's the buyer, there's the seller, there's the buyer's attorney, the seller's attorney, there's the buyer's broker, there's the seller's broker. So really there's 6 people. Okay. The qualified intermediary, they don't care because we don't go on vacation. Okay. There's always somebody in our shop to take care of closing the deal if it's got to be closed.
Sure.
Okay. And we're only needed at certain points in the transaction. But can you imagine if you're trying to negotiate a deal and get a contract signed, if you closed your relinquished property on, June 1st, and you've got people going on vacation, you got 6 different vacations to navigate. You've got the 4th of July weekend, which is going to be, people are going to be shut down for that week, or they're going to be on vacation for that week. And so what we find is, and you got weekends. Okay. So in a 45-day period, there's probably 6 of those days or more, 8 or 10 of those days. It'd be 7 weeks times 2, probably 10 to 14 of those days are weekends.
Yeah.
Okay. Commercial brokers don't really work on weekends. So if you're looking at buying a commercial
residential brokers do, for the most part. The good ones do, at least.
Yeah. My girlfriend is a residential broker in Aspen, and yes, I mean, she works mornings, afternoons, evenings, Monday through Sunday.
Yep.
It's it's a 24/7 job if you're on the residential side. So that's those are some of the biggest challenges. Finding something that you like, and I would tell people, don't settle. I mean, under no circumstances do you settle for something you don't want. Some people say, how about, can I park this and then sell it 2 years from now? Sure you can. But you're taking some market risk doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
What we see a lot of times, particularly in a hot market, is there were some strategies that were approved in 2000 by the IRS. We actually did our first exchange in this structure in 1995. Okay, but it's called the reverse exchange. And if you're fearful that you're going to have problems with your replacement property, there are structures that allow you to control your replacement property before you sell your relinquished property. Okay, it's called a reverse exchange. And it's got some pretty tight time frames.
What are those time frames? I am curious to hear that.
Well, you still got 180 days. So in those transactions, I said you didn't own the property. Notice I said you take control of the property. You control the property. So you engage what's called an exchange accommodating title holder. We use the acronym EAT. And that EAT takes title to that property and can hold that property for 180 days. So by the 180th day, you have to have sold your relinquished property and acquired your replacement property from the exchange accommodating title holder. And there again, that's a tight time frame.
Yeah, okay. For sure.
Usually you see those transactions when a buyer, the buyer on the relinquished property might need 2 or 3 more weeks to get their loan in gear, but you don't have 2 or 3 more weeks on the purchase of your replacement property because you've negotiated, a firm closing date with your seller. He's got to have his money to go do something else with it. Or you've got a loan commitment on the replacement property that's going to run out and you got to buy it,
Yeah.
or you're going to be subject to increased loan rates and subsequent reduced cash flow.
I could be wrong, but I believe that so my office used to be on Pleasantburg Drive. It's now where the Guest and Brady attorneys'
Oh
main
yeah,
office is. They purchased our office on Pleasantburg and we moved over to near the mall on Woods Crossing. And I believe my company did a reverse 1031
joiner,
when they
Danny.
did that. Yeah, I believe
Yeah,
Danny
we've done a
did.
lot of work. We've done a lot of work with Danny over the
Yeah,
years.
yeah, no doubt. But I'm pretty
Danny
sure
and I
that
go
was a
way
reverse.
back. Huh? I met Danny when Danny was in high school playing
How about that?
basketball at Wade Hampton or Eastside. I guess it was Wade Hampton maybe.
That's great. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was a freshman I was a freshman at Furman.
How about that? He's great, and obviously I love being with Seed and Joyner companies, and yeah, it was just interesting to see that whole process because they told us, it was a long time in coming that it was going to be moving offices and whatnot. And then I think I heard Danny maybe told us, or maybe I just heard through the grapevine that they were doing a reverse 1031. So
Yeah.
that was actually the first time I'd actually heard someone say that they were doing it. And I found that pretty interesting. Do you run into any misconceptions that people have when it comes to 1031 exchanges?
Yeah, there are a couple. Number one is that it's difficult to do. Okay. And for the uninitiated, it can be difficult. And our job as your qualified intermediary is to navigate you through that, to walk you through it, and make it as simple as possible. Okay. The one thing we do is we don't assume you know anything. Okay. Unless you've been a client two or three or four times. Okay. I've got clients that call me and say, I don't have to, I can assume that they know a certain amount of
Sure.
information.
Yep.
The second is that it's expensive. Okay. And relatively speaking, it's a pretty good deal. Okay. Um, you'll find, I would just, shop for QIs and don't always take the bottom basement. Okay. Because oftentimes there are indicators. Maybe you're not getting the experience that you need. Maybe they don't have the knowledge that you need. Okay. And uh, so those are really the two. And the other is that there are no partial exchanges. Some people think it's an all or nothing proposition, and that's not true. Okay. Now, to expand on what we spoke about earlier, when you do a partial exchange, okay, the first money that you reinvest is a reinvestment of your basis. So when you go to closing and you sell, there's really two buckets that you're working with. One is your basis and one is your profit. Okay. And when you go to buy replacement property, whether it's one, two, three, multiple properties, okay, the first money that goes into those properties comes out of that basis bucket. And it's only after you've emptied that basis bucket do you start taking money out of the gain bucket. And so at the end of the transaction, whatever's left in the gain bucket is going to be taxed.
Sure. That makes sense. So I've got a few more questions here, and I know you're busy. I'm gonna let you go. You guys are all over the country, is my understanding. How many states?
There's only about 5 or 6 states we won't work in, but our business is concentrated in the Southeast and really heavy in South Carolina and Western North Carolina.
Okay. What would you say with that knowledge, with your knowledge of being not specific to Greenville, even though you're a Greenville-based company? What's unique about the Greenville market when it comes to 1031 exchanges as opposed to other markets? Is there anything that stands out?
I mean, a couple things. We've seen, the market stayed vibrant. I mean, you've got a booming market there, people moving in like crazy. It's number four, number five, one of the best places to live. Um, you get a great downtown. So it's really it's a little bit insulated. And we've seen this through, I don't know how many cycles I've been through, three or four. We don't get the troughs that we see in other markets. Um, it's a little bit more stable.
Okay,
So,
interesting.
but that's it's been that way forever and ever. I mean, we're not in a LA or San Francisco or Miami where when things go fall apart, they fall way apart.
Right.
Not that we're not going to get there, But I mean, that's really the thing. I mean,
Interesting.
great place to be. I mean, and I still have a house in Greenville, and I've been there when I started. When I started at Firm University, they told us don't go downtown. Go down to the basketball game, watch the game, get in your car, and come back.
Get out of
There's
there.
nothing good that can happen downtown after dark.
Yep. It's crazy.
Okay, I mean, literally nothing was downtown. And I've been fortunate to be involved in a lot of the things that went on downtown. I mean, it's hard to go down any major artery in Greenville, South Carolina, and not see a project that's been touched by a 1031 exchange that Banker
I
Exchange
bet.
had.
Yeah. That's not hard to believe. How long have you guys been in business again?
We did our first exchange in April of 1992.
92. Okay.
So coming up on 30, getting ready, 30, coming up on our start of 34th year, I guess.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah,
Um,
I was 6 years old when you did that first exchange.
and
So
so, and I still remember a lot of the details of that first exchange.
why did you get
Um,
into this? What prompted you to get into this business?
well, I was peddling stocks and bonds at J.C. Bradford, which is now part of UBS, down in the Hyatt on Main Street. And a friend of mine called me up and asked me who he'd been my roommate. He was an attorney and a CPA working for a local CPA firm. And he asked me, he said, would you be willing to hold $75,000 for 3 days? We'll pay you $2,000 to do it. And I knew about 1031s. We'd studied them in school, but very briefly. And I said, sure. And I said, who would have done this for you if I hadn't have done it? He said, there's nobody in town. There's nobody around that does it. And so,
That sounds like a business
as
opportunity.
well, when somebody's not doing something, you have to look and say, are they not doing it because there's no money in it, or
Sure.
they're not doing it because nobody understands it yet? And so, I mean, if you want to open a buggy whip manufacturer tomorrow, that's probably not something you want to do.
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
because there's no market for buggy whips anymore.
Right.
All right. And so that's kind of my point and I've had several businesses that we've been fortunate to start, and we've been on the front end of the curve. And so, this one, it's been a lot of fun helping people defer taxes and also helping them build wealth and, watch Greenville grow and thrive.
Absolutely.
I mean, I can remember when Five Forks did not exist.
Yeah. It's just
Okay. I
farm
helped with the
country out
bylaw
there.
that was built up. Pardon?
It was farm country out there for the longest time.
Yeah, I can remember I did the deal that allowed the bylaw to be built at Five Forks. I built a Ford dealership. It's not even a Ford dealership anymore. I think it's been torn down. Something else is out there. Um, but I mean, it's crazy. I mean, Greenville, and I did a lot of work on Lake Kiowee, with the developer of Lake Kiowee, dear friend of mine, and he'd call me up and say, we're having an auction, you better be ready. And sure enough, it would, we get 5 or 6 transactions at a time out of his office.
I bet. So
So,
couple more questions here and then I'll let you go. Is there, so obviously we're in an uncertain time economically. I guess we're recording this. We're recording this on April 2nd, which is Trump's declared Liberation Day when it comes to tariffs and all of that. Is any of this affecting 1031 exchanges in a positive or a negative way? Any of the uncertainty or high mortgage rates or anything like that?
well, mortgage rates affected a little bit. Okay. Um, truthfully, we've seen vibrant growth in our business over the last 5 years. There was what I would call an anomaly that occurred during COVID, where the number of transactions went through the roof, and I
Sure.
can't explain to you why. Maybe it was people buying resort property and buying beach houses and traveling and finding places they liked. But we were extremely busy, almost too busy, if there is such a thing, in 2020, 2021. But I take a Warren Buffett approach. Okay, we're going to make money no matter who's in the White House. There's an
Sure.
opportunity no matter who's in the White House.
Absolutely.
And real estate is one avenue. The tax deferral, and one of the things we talk about in our seminars is, the greatest friend to building wealth is time. And the greatest enemy to building wealth is taxes.
That's accurate.
Okay.
I fully agree with that.
If we can control the tax piece of it, then we're ahead of the game.
100%.
So, I go back to, we're a little bit insulated. Now, with that being said, between 2008 and 2011, I could probably count the number of deals we did total on both my hands. So when we say we've been in the business 35 years, 33 years, but for the 4 years where nobody was in business doing anything, the Great Recession, it's been good.
How did you stay in business during that time? I mean, was that just everyone just had to cut back?
Well, that's a story for another podcast. But
all right, well,
the 1031
give us the cliff notes.
Well, so the 1031 business catapulted me in 2001. Catapulted us into the real estate syndication business. We started a company called TIC Properties, and we sold fractional interest in institutional assets to 1031 exchange investors.
Interesting.
Matter of fact, the very first asset that we sold, we still own. But we did 33 syndications during that period of time between 2001 and 2008. We built a vibrant property management business. We were fully vertically integrated. We could buy it, finance it, distribute it, operate it, lease it, manage it, and sell it, all in our shop.
Wow.
And so when the market turned, not many sponsors were in that position. So when the market blew up, we stopped syndicating new deals, but we happened to have a nice management portfolio that was about 9 million square feet. It was about 1,800 investors we were servicing. And so we had some recurring revenue from that was able to carry us through that slow period of time.
That's great. Yeah, I love to hear those stories. I graduated college in 2008, so I entered the adult workforce into that Great Recession, and it was It was a very interesting experience. But I love to hear stories from companies that weathered that storm, because it was quite the storm. Particularly if you're in real estate or real estate adjacent industries.
Right.
All right, last question, and I think you're going to like this one. What would you say to someone who doesn't think they need a 1031 intermediary? They could just do it themselves.
Well, first of all, it's a necessary evil. Okay. I don't agree with the fact that they created this cottage industry with this section of the Internal Revenue Code. I think there are always easier ways to do things. Okay. But unfortunately, they've drafted the code the way it is. The one thing is the taxpayer during the exchange process cannot take actual receipt of their money, nor have constructive receipt of their money. And so if you're not going to use a qualified intermediary, there are a couple of other safe harbors that are much less popular and much more burdensome, if you will. And so the qualified intermediary is the easiest way to go to accommodate your exchange. So I would simply say, I wish you the best of luck.
What sort of pricing can people expect when they're doing a 1031 exchange?
You're going to see pricing all over the board, depending on, what folks do. I can speak to our pricing. I don't really speak to other people's pricing.
Sure.
For a traditional exchange, that's a forward exchange that involves, one piece of relinquished property and up to 2 pieces of replacement property, or 3 properties in total. It's $1,500. That's a flat rate. If you decide that you want to wait till the last minute and you want to inconvenience us, they're going to put you an expedite fee on that, just because they've got to change their work day to be able to accommodate your procrastination.
Yep.
For a reverse exchange, you're probably looking at a base fee, and we try to avoid those every chance we get, because there's a question about whether they're even money makers, to be honest with you, because of the amount of accounting that has to go in, the tax return, preparation that has to go in, and but a reverse exchange is going to run you about $5,000, and then on top of that, the $1,500 exchange fee.
Okay.
And then if you've got a situation where you need to make improvements to a piece of property to meet your exchange value requirement, okay, to get to that, the amount of money you need to spend to fully defer, you're looking at typically that $5,000 plus 1% of construction costs.
That's great. Great breakdown of information. And I really enjoyed this discussion. So, John, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for imparting all of that. I mean, that was a tremendous. I've been to classes on 1031 exchanges, but just being able to pick your brain was really helpful for me. So thank you so much.
Well, we've got some more coming up. We've got some more at the Greater Greenville Association of Realtor. We'll be in there. Check the calendar, but I think it's late April, early May. Okay. And then we also just wrapped up. Banker Exchange was one of the sponsors of the South Carolina Rocky Mountain Real Estate Summit out in Aspen, Colorado. So we've had a group of we had attorneys, we had some clients, we had some real estate brokers come out, enjoy 3 days of continuing education and 3 or 4 days of winter activities in the Great Rocky Mountains. So and that's been scheduled for next year, the weekend of February 7th. So put that on your calendar. Come join us. Love to have you out.
Fantastic. Yeah, there's a lot of realtors that listen to the show. So if you want to go to a Banker Exchange class, look at the GJR calendar. You got plenty of time to do that. And yeah, I've seen you guys and
we'll be in.
That are on there.
I'm in Greenville 1 week. I'm in the Midlands 1 week. I'm in Hilton Head and Myrtle Beach, the same back to back, and they're all between April 22nd and May the 7th, I think.
All right. So, well, sounds great. Well, John, thank you so much. For our listeners, that was John Boyd. I will put contact info for Banker Exchange in the show notes, along with my own information. Of course, if you need a realtor in this area, just let me know. My information in the show notes, and please like, rate, review, subscribe the show, and we will talk again next time.